Listen, before this story even begins, you already know how it ends. They die, the whole team, on a grey afternoon, in the fog, against the back wall of a church on a hill above the city that loved them. This is the story of the greatest football team that ever lived, and the 15 seconds that wiped it from the face of the earth. You've probably never heard their name. By the end of this, I promise you, you will never forget it. They were called Il Grande Torino, the Great Torino, and in the years right after the Second World War, while Italy was still digging itself out of the rubble, this one team from the city of Turin did not just win. They ruled 5 league titles in a row, a single season in which they scored 125 goals and finished 16 points clear of everyone else. And there was an afternoon when the national team of Italy walked out onto the pitch, and 10 of the 11 men wearing the shirt came from this one club. 10 out of 11. So here is the question this entire story turns on. How does a team like that, a dynasty, a golden generation, an entire country's pride, simply cease to exist in the space of a single afternoon? To understand it, you have to understand what a football team could mean in Italy in those years. The country had come out of the war on the losing side. Bombed, divided, ashamed, poor. There was very little left to feel proud of. And into that grey, exhausted nation walked 11 men in deep maroon shirts who simply refused to lose. They weren't only winning matches. For a few short seasons, they were the one thing a broken country could point at and say, that is ours, and it is the best in the world. And to understand the team, you have to understand the man who led it. His name was Valentino Mazzola. He was not born into football's comfort. He grew up working class on the edge of Milan, a labourer on the floor of the Alfa Romeo factory, kicking a ball across the gravel between his shifts. But there was something in him the game could not ignore. By his mid-20s, he was the captain of Torino and the captain of Italy. The complete footballer. A man who could defend, create and score, who once finished a season as the whole league's top scorer with 29 goals. And he had a signal. When a match was drifting, when it needed taking by the throat, Mazzola would roll his sleeves up to the elbow. And everyone in the stadium, his teammates, the crowd, the men marking him, knew exactly what was coming next. Their home was a tight, roaring little ground called the Stadio Filadelfia, and it was a fortress. In one of those title seasons, they won 19 of their 20 home games. The fans used to tell a story about a quarter of an hour. They said that when a trumpet sounded from the terraces, Torino would surge, and in 15 unstoppable minutes, they would bury whoever was standing in front of them. Maybe that part is just a legend the city told itself. But the goals were real. The titles were real. And around Mazzola stood a team of names that Italy still says today almost like a prayer. Loic, Gabetto, Ossola, the goalkeeper, Bacigalupo, the elegant young defender, Maroso, Rigamonti at the back, men coached in those final years by a Hungarian called Erbstein, a man who had survived the persecutions of the war itself, only to find his life again here, with this team, in this city. What made them frightening was not simply that they won, it was how completely they won. Other teams arrived at the Philadelphia already half-beaten, knowing exactly what was coming. Torino did not sit back and protect a lead. They came at you in waves, all maroon shirts and movement, and they kept coming until the game was buried. For 5 seasons, the rest of Italian football was essentially playing for second place. They were so far ahead of their own time that when people tried, years later, to explain them to a generation that never saw them play, the words always fell a little short. You had to have been there. You had to have stood on those packed terraces in the cold and watched it with your own eyes. By the spring of 1949, the 5th title in a row was almost in their hands. But they were exhausted, carrying injuries, near the end of a long punishing season. And then came an invitation that, looking back, no one should ever have accepted. A friendly match all the way over in Lisbon, a favour for the Portuguese captain, Francisco Ferreira. It meant another long journey, more miles in tired legs, for a game that meant nothing at all in the league table. Some people said, quietly, don't go, but they went. They always went together. And on the 4th of May, they climbed aboard a 3-engined airliner in Lisbon for the long flight home to Turin. The weather waiting for them over northern Italy that afternoon was closing in fast. Low cloud pressing down onto the hills, cold rain, a wind out of the southwest. As the plane came in toward Turin, the fog grew so thick that the pilots could see barely 40 meters in front of the aircraft. And somewhere in all that white nothing, the instruments and the ground beneath them stopped telling the same story. The hills that ring the city of Turin are crowned by a great basilica. The Basilica of Superga, perched high on a ridge, a landmark you can see for miles on a clear day. But this was not a clear day. The plane was flying lower than anyone on board could possibly have known. And dead ahead of them, hidden somewhere inside that cloud, was the solid stone wall of the church. At 5:03 in the afternoon, on the 4th of May, 1949, the aircraft struck the retaining wall of the Basilica of Superga. There were 31 people on board that flight, the entire first team, the coaching staff, the officials of the club, 3 journalists who traveled with the team everywhere they went, and the 4 crew. There were no survivors, none. In a single instant, in the fog, on a hilltop, above the city that worshipped them, the greatest team in the world was simply gone. Italy could not believe it. It refused to. The news moved through Turin like a physical blow, door to door, street to street, a whole city going silent at once. And then it did the only thing left to do. It came out into the streets. By some accounts, 500,000 people walked behind the coffins, a slow river of grief winding through a city in mourning, for 18 footballers and the men around them who had given a defeated, exhausted country something pure to believe in. The league did not make anyone play on, as if nothing had happened. Torino were declared the champions of that season exactly as they lay. And for the handful of games still left on the calendar, it was the club's own teenage boys, the youth team, who pulled on the maroon shirts and quietly finished what the men had started. And the grief did not stay inside Turin. Torino had been the very spine of the national team. And now that spine was gone. When the next World Cup came around, barely a year later, the footballers of Italy were so shaken, so haunted by what had happened in the sky over Superga, that they refused to fly to it at all. They crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean to the tournament by boat, an entire nation's team sailing for 2 weeks to a World Cup, because the air itself had already taken too much from them. And the numbers never moved again. The 5 titles in a row, the 125-goal season, the 10 men out of 11. They simply stopped, frozen in place on the afternoon the plane went down. A perfect, terrible monument to a team that never got to grow old. They never declined. They were never broken on the pitch, never overtaken, never made ordinary by time the way every great team eventually is. They were taken, all of them, all at once, at the very summit of everything they were. But there is one last thing you need to know. On the day Valentino Mazzola died on that hill, he left behind a son, a boy of just 6, named Sandro. And that boy grew up in the long grey shadow of Superga to become a great footballer himself, a star for Inter Milan and for Italy. He lived out the future the fog had stolen from his father. They were the finest team that ever played. And for the sake of one foggy afternoon, almost no one outside Italy still remembers their names. Well, now you do. If you want more of football's forgotten greats, there's one more story I think you need to hear next.